Let's now start seeing the three data transformation methods in practice, starting with the map method in this video. And as we just learned, the map method is yet another way that we can use to loop over arrays. But unlike for each, the map method will give us a brand new array. And this new array will contain in each position the result of applying a callback function to the original array elements. So let's see how that works. And let's start by bringing back our movements array here. So this one, so we will once more work with these movements. And in this one, we will try to convert them to US dollars. So let's suppose these movements are in euros and we now want to convert them to US dollars. And let's suppose that 1 euro is worth $1.1. So let's just store that conversion rate here first to a separate variable. So euro to USD is 1.1. And so now what we want to do is to basically multiply each element of the movements array by this 1.1. So let's say movements.map. And then, just like in the for each method, we need a callback function. And this callback function also gets as an argument the current array element. So again, just like in the for each method that we studied before. And that's why I said back then that once you understood the for each method, all the other methods will then become a lot easier to understand. So let's call this one here mov one more time. And then here in the callback function, we need to return the value that we want the new array to have in the current position. And so in this case, we want the original array times the euro to USD conversion rate. And this will make sense when we now see this result. And so let's actually store it to a variable. So we already know that the map method will return a brand new array. And so we need to store that somewhere. So let's call it movements USD. And then let's log both to the console movements and movements USD. Give it a save. And sometimes we need to reload the page as well. But anyway, here is the result. Now, never mind these multiplication errors here. I will explain you a little bit later where they come from. But essentially, this new value here is now 220, which is exactly 200 times 1.1. And so indeed, we ended up with a new array containing all the movements, but converted from euros to US dollars. And again, that's because that is exactly what we returned here from this callback function. We could, of course, have returned simply something else. So we could have returned simply 23. And so what do you think we will end up in this situation? Well, we now simply have an array of the same length, which in each of the position contains 23, because that's what we returned from the callback function. And so in each iteration of the original movements array, it simply put 23 into the new array at the same position. But of course, that's a little bit useless. And so let's go back to the example that we're working with. Great. And of course, you can also see that the original movements array was not mutated at all, right? And so indeed, the map method really only returns a new array with the new elements. And this really is the fundamentals of how the map method works. So we can use this, and we will use it in all kinds of different situations. Now, just for fun, let's write the same thing here using a for off loop. So we can create another mov, and then we are looping the movements, of course. And so in this loop, we want to create a new array. And so in this case, actually, we first need to create that new array. So let's call it again movements USD, but then 4. So here we first need to define that empty array, And then as we loop over movements, we keep pushing a value to the new movements USD for array. So push and the current element times euros to USD. Let's log that as well, and it should look exactly the same. And in fact, it does. And so, yeah, we could have written this here, and it doesn't look too bad either, but it's a completely different philosophy. So here, in the map method, we use a function to solve this problem of creating a new array. While here, we simply loop over one array and then manually create a new one. So these are completely different philosophies, or we can also say paradigms. So this here is more in line with functional programming, which is something that I have mentioned a couple of times in this course, and we will talk about it later in greater detail. And in modern JavaScript, there's definitely a push going on in the direction of functional programming, so of a more functional language, and therefore in modern JavaScript, this here is the way to go. So using methods together with callback functions like this is the new and modern way of doing stuff. All right, but now let's actually make our callback function here look a little bit cleaner. So this callback function, we can simplify it greatly. So do you remember arrow functions? We could perfectly use an arrow function here and simplify this here into just one line of code. So here is my challenge for you. Do you think that you can do that yourself? So basically replacing this callback with an arrow function. Take a minute and see if you can do that for yourself, and I'll see you back here in a second. So let's just copy this and then replace this by parts. So first we can remove the function keyword and then replace it with an arrow. Then we can also remove these parentheses here because there's only one argument. And finally, since we only have one line of code, we can remove the curly braces, and we can even remove the return statement. And so this code that we have here now is exactly the same as before. So we can comment out this one here. And of course, I'm leaving it here for reference. But as I save it now, you see that the result is exactly the same. And so here we now have a nice and clean one-liner callback function just like this. However, many people don't like the way that this looks. So they argue that this lacks the function and the return keyword, which they say leads to bad readability and that it makes this whole thing more difficult to understand. And while I can see that that might be true, I actually do prefer the fact how much smaller and cleaner this code is. So in my opinion, if you understand well enough how the arrow function actually works, then you will become familiar with this pretty quickly. And so then there is no problem in writing code like this. Okay? The main thing that you need to keep in mind is that here we are actually returning this value. So you need to remember that this is like writing return here. And so if you understand that, then you're good to go. So I will actually use arrow functions in these situations in the rest of the course, because I believe that they are perfect for these small callback functions. In my opinion, they were really developed for this kind of application. But as always, if you do prefer the regular function syntax, then please feel 100% free to keep using them instead. And with that being said, let's now experiment a little bit more and explore the map method some more. So just like the for each method, the map method also has access to the exact same three parameters. So besides the current array element, which is this one here, we also get access to the current index as well as the whole array. So let's now use the map method to loop again over the movements array, but this time we're going to create a string similar to the ones that we printed to the console earlier using for each. So let me actually get that logic And so it's this one here. So let's specify a callback function. And indeed, now I will actually use an arrow function. And so, as I said, we get access to the current element, but also to the index and to the entire array. This time we do need a block, at least for now. And then here we have our logic. Now, in this case, we will not log something to the console. So instead, we want to return the string so that it then gets put into the new array that results from the map method. So let's say here, movements descriptions. So that's a long name. But anyway, again, here we do not want to log something to the console. So we don't want to simply do something with this value like we do when we console.log. Instead, we really want to return it. And so that will then place this value into the new array. So let's save that. Let's then also log this to the console, movement descriptions. And so indeed, we get this array with these strings that we previously logged to the console. And by the way, it's completely acceptable to have two return statements or even more in the same function, as long as only one of them is executed, right? So in this case, either this one here is executed or this one. It's impossible for both of them to return at the same time, right? And actually, we can even simplify this whole thing here, because these two strings are essentially the exact same thing, except for this word here. And so let's do something else here, right? Now you also have this math.absolute value, but if the value is already positive, as it is here, then that simply makes no difference. And so let's use a ternary operator here to put either withdrew or deposited right here. And so this has nothing to do with the map method, but yeah, it's a good way to also keep practicing the other skills that we have been learning. So we can check if the movement is greater than 0, so the same condition as here, and if it is, then at this part of the string, it should say deposited. And if not, well, then it should say withdrew. And so like this, we built this string all in one go. And so we can get rid of this, we can get rid of this, and so therefore we don't need the return keyword anymore. And so it works just the same. Okay? Now in this case, we don't need this array here, so let's actually also get rid of it. And it's a good idea to keep in mind why we actually get access to these two parameters here. So one more time, all we do here is to pass this callback function into the map method, right? But we do not call this function by ourselves. It is the map method who will call this function for each of the array elements in the movement array. Okay? Now, each time that the map method calls or callback, it will simply pass in the current array element as well as the current index and the whole array. And of these three, here we are only using the first two, just the current element and the current index. All right, and with this, I hope that by now it is really crystal clear how this all works. Now you could say that what we did here with this map method is essentially the same as what we did with the for each method. But in fact, there is a big difference between these two approaches. So before, we printed each line individually to the console as we were looping over the array. So in each of the iterations, we performed some action that was then visible in the console. And we can call this a side effect. So the for each method creates side effects. But now, here with this map method, all we did was to return each of the strings from the callback. And so basically they got added into a new array. And then finally, we logged that entire array to the console and not the elements one by one. And so here, in this map method, we did not create a side effect in each of the iteration. All we did was to build a brand new array. And this idea of side effects will become important again as we talk more about functional programming. Great, and this is how the map method works. In the next video, we will see a more practical application of it in the context of our bankist application.